Okay, so whenever you're ready, you can start. So are you able to go to the right screen? Or is this
Yeah, this
is the right screen? Okay.
yeah, this is the correct one here.
Okay, all right, yeah, you got it. Okay then, all right, so take it away. And once you're done, I'll make you the host. So once you're done, you can just end the chat. Okay. All right, so take it away when you're ready.
Okay, so good day to everyone watching. For those of you who don't know, I mean, you would have known that, you should know already, but I am FIDE Master Ryan Harper of Trinidad and Tobago. And the session today will be on the Italian game. Now, I mean, the Italian game is an opening that goes way back because it's one of the most basic openings in chess, because it starts off with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4. One of the most basic openings in chess, the Italian game. Although I've been playing Italian game for a long time, I also play the Europes, and I learned a lot of theory about the Italian game from Grandmaster Sergei Tebiakov, who is a grandmaster from Netherlands. I got some coaching from Tebiakov at a point in time, and I got a lot of guidance on how to play the Italian game. But some people think that the Italian game, be it this basic opening, is a beginner opening, but it is played at a very, very high level. It has been played by Carlsen and Nakamura last month. Last month there was a game between Carlsen and Nakamura in the Italian game. So it is played at a very high level because White is not trying to throw any vicious or quick attack. White is just developing their pieces, Black is developing their pieces, and then trying to take a small advantage and turn it into something. Well, I mean, I see three of you all here. Do any of you all play the Italian game? You can say in the chat, you can type in the chat and let me know. Any Italian game players? Okay, so you're planning on learning it. What about the other two? Okay, so e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4. Okay, one says sometimes. And our main focus will be on the response bishop c5. Now after bishop c5, there are two moves that can be played. When I play the Italian game, I play pawn to d3. But some players like to first play pawn to c3. But my preference has always been to play pawn to d3 first. And after knight f6, there is castle. There is also pawn to c3, which is, I guess, the main alternative. And after pawn to c3, if Black plays d6, White can castle. Black can castle. After knight bd7, a6, and bishop to b3. I have a question to ask you. Can anybody think of the reason why White puts that bishop on b3? Mohan, you play this opening sometimes. Exactly. The bishop goes to b3, so that if that knight tries to get that bishop off the board, bishop will then jump into that c2 square and escape from the knight. Because that bishop is a very important bishop. That bishop is often called the Italian bishop. And white does not want to exchange that bishop for a knight too easily. There are times when you can do it, but generally, white does not want to exchange that bishop for a knight. The only piece that white usually allows an exchange with for that bishop is black's light square bishop. So if black was to somehow play the bishop to e6, then this exchange might be allowed. Doesn't mean that white will play it, but that exchange would be allowed. But white does not want to allow the knight to capture the bishop. So in this position, if black was to play knight a5 now immediately, he won't be able to get the bishop because the bishop will go to b5. And now if we play a6 or c6, if a6 or c6 would be played, then the bishop will go to a4. And the knight still can't get the bishop. And if b5 was played next, the bishop would go to c2. And there would also be a threat by white to play pawn to b4, attacking the knight and the bishop at the same time, which would mean that either the knight or the bishop would have to move to avoid b4 winning material. So in this position, after knight b2 and a6, bishop b3 is played. And this position we have here on the board right now is probably the most popular position that you will see in an Italian game. I mean, there are other positions, but this one is the most popular position out of the Italian game. And here, there are a number of different things there are a number of different moves that can be played. So let me go to another. Right, so what we saw just now, we got to this position. So I just want you all to know that there are a number of different moves that can be played in this position. There is knight e7. And knight e7 is with the idea black wants to get this knight across to g6 quickly, and then black wants to try to set up his pieces to attack white on the king side. That's the idea behind this move. So this is one possibility. Another possibility is bishop to e6 immediately. Another one would be to play knight a5 immediately, but of course we know knight a5 is met with bishop to b5. But that's not the only move, because after knight to a5, there's also bishop takes f7 check. And when it recaptures, then pawn to b4. But like I said, white usually does not want to give away that bishop so easily. So although this is good for white, it is not preferred for white to play this way. It's preferred to play bishop to b5 and preserve that bishop. And there is also this move a5. e5, which is similar to a6. But a5, this move is played where black is trying to gain more space. So black is trying to stop white from being able to play pawn to b4. The bishop can go back to a7. So black is basically making sure to hold on to some space, because many times in the Italian game, because this pawn is on c3, many times white plays pawn to b4. So black now pulls white back, says, no, I don't want to give you all that room to expand on the queen side. So I'm going to play pawn to a5, limiting white from being able to gather all that room. And usually the response to a5 is pawn to a4, not allowing that pawn to go further down the board. Pawn to a4, keeping an eye on that b5 square, and making sure there's no pawn to a5 and pawn to a4 and knight to a5. And then trying to see some ways of trying to use that e6 square. So that's why white plays pawn to a4. So in this position, our main focus, of course, like I said, is pawn to a6. After pawn to a6, bishop to b3, bishop to a7, and often now, white plays pawn to h3. This is a very important move. It is not a forced move, but it is an important move. Because if white wants, when white plays pawn to c3, this move is played with the intention at some later point to play pawn to d4. That's one thing. The second thing is, when white plays knight to d2, the intention of knight to d2 is to play rook to e1, knight to f1, and then knight to g3. This is the main intention, although sometimes the knight also goes to c4, but the main intention is to play knight to f1 to g3. But if in this position, white was to play rook to e1, to try to do the same thing, if rook to e1 is played, black can play knight to g4, where the knight and the bishop are attacking the pawn on f2. And then white would have to play some weird move like rook to e2, twist, and then try to maneuver this knight to g3. Chase away the knight. And then the rook would probably have to go back because the rook would be blocking the queen from going to the e2 or f3 square. Rather than have to go through all that trouble of reorganizing white's pieces, if black plays knight to g4, white instead just plays pawn to h3. So that when pawn to h3 is played, now rook to e1 can be played without the worry of the knight going to g4, attacking the pawn on f2. Yo, just remember, if you have any questions, you can ask them. You can type it in the chat, and I will answer the questions along the way. So anyone with any questions, just put your questions right there in the chat, and I will answer. Any questions? Just say no or yes if you have one, and if you have a question, you can type the question. Does anyone have any questions so far? Mohan, no questions? Jalen, no questions? Okay, good. So yes, h3 is played to cover that g4 square. Now, let's say black plays bishop to e6. Now, when bishop e6 is played, again here, white has a choice. White can play rook to e1. White can play bishop to c2. And actually, those are the two main moves in this position: rook to e1 and bishop to c2. Now I have played both, but my preference is to play bishop to c2. h6 is often played by black, and after rook to e1, queen to d7, knight f1, rook to e8. Now, in this position, it is possible for white to play pawn to d4. Pawn to d4 is not a bad move. Knight to g3 is the main move. But pawn to d4 is not a bad move. When d4 is played, white is threatening something. D4 comes with a threat. There's a threat of pawn to d5, which would be attacking the knight and the bishop at the same time. That means that when d4 is played, d4 is a forcing move for which black must respond because there is a threat. There's a threat to play pawn to d5. So black must respond to pawn to d4. Now, if black decides to play pawn takes pawn, and white recaptures with the c pawn, now it is possible to play knight to b4, attacking the bishop. And remember, white does not want to allow that knight to get that bishop. So you won't play bishop to d3. Maybe you can play bishop to b6, b3, sorry. But no, there's a problem. There is a problem. There is a bit of a problem, not a huge problem. It's a small problem, but there is a bit of a problem when bishop to b3 is played. And the problem is when black plays bishop takes b3 and white captures with the queen, the pawn on e4 is under attack. Now the pawn on e4 is not lost as yet because the queen is attacking the knight on c6 right now. So that knight first has to get out of the attack. And it's quite possible that this knight can just go back to c6. But now there's a threat on the pawn on e4, but there's also a threat on the pawn on d4. White is threatening to capture this one because two pieces are attacking it. White is also threatening to capture one on d4 because two pieces are attacking it. And white should not capture this one. This is a bad move. Because if this move is played, it doesn't matter any rook, but this rook. After rook to b8, when the queen captures this pawn, now there's bishop takes pawn with a discovered attack on the queen. And when the queen moves out of the attack, the bishop just goes back. And now black has better control in this position. He has a little bit better control in the center. He has that bishop sitting down there on that long diagonal. And black, of course, is also putting pressure down these lines. So black's position is the preferred position. White is not losing, but black's position is preferred. Also, another option could have been to use this rook. And when the queen captures the pawn, then there's knight takes pawn. And it looks as if there is a tactic with pawn to d5, but then that would allow bishop takes f2, which would get the rook on e1. And if the rook captures instead, the rook takes knight, rook takes rook, and then d5. This is not a bad option. because the knight is under attack and the bishop is also under attack at the same time. But I imagine that this king being forced to come out does not make the position too comfortable for white. But okay, let's go back. So basically what I'm trying to show here is that in this setup, one must not play d4 too quickly. Most of the time, when white plays d4, this knight is already on the g3 square. And the reason why that knight should be on the g3 square is because that knight is already protecting this pawn on e4, so that when d4 is played and these captures occur and the knight goes to b4, that pawn on e4 is already protected by two pieces. So when the bishop to b3 is played, and bishop takes bishop, and the queen recaptures the bishop, attacking the knight, and the knight goes back to c6, the only thing that is under attack then is the pawn on d4 by the bishop and knight, which can be protected by queen to c3. Let me show you what I mean. Let me just waste a move. Let's just waste a move. Waste a move doing something. Let's say rook to b8. Now when d4 is played, pawn takes pawn, knight to b4, bishop to b3, bishop takes bishop, queen captures bishop. Now this pawn on e4 is now protected by two pieces. So that pawn is not vulnerable. And the knight goes back to c6, now attacking the pawn on d4 with two pieces. There's a very simple queen to c3 or queen to d3, where that pawn is protected by the knight and the queen. And everything is covered, and white has his two pawns in the center, allowing white to have the slightly better position because white has more control in the center. And this is one of the ideas of what I call the slow Italian. White slowly tries to gain advantage in the center. White slowly tries to hold that center and get that central advantage, and slowly tries to move his forces forward, take space from his opponent, to then try to eventually win the game. Sometimes it could be an end game. Sometimes it could even be a nice attack. So this is the idea and way of playing the Italian. But one must always be very careful about the defense of the e4 and d4 pawns. Very important that you're careful about that. So you don't play d4 too quickly until the e4 pawn is properly defended. And that's the reason why the rook comes to the e8 square. The rook often comes to the e8 square to slow white down from being able to play pawn to d4. That's the reason why the rook goes there early. So white has to take their time, put their pieces in the correct squares first before trying to play pawn to d4, so that they don't lose their pawn on e4. That would no longer be protected by the pawn that was on d3, because that pawn on d3 would be on d4. Still no questions? So everybody's understanding everything so far then. Just give me a yes if you understand everything so far. Adrian, you understand everything there so far? All right, that's good. Now, another important thing to cover in this setup, and I'm going to show you using a game that I lost. I'm going to show you this using a game that I lost. After e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6. Slightly different move order, but the same thing. Right, h3. h3 in this position is not recommended. And I wonder if anybody can think about the reason why h3 is not recommended in this position. Anybody has an idea why? If you have an idea, say yes. If you don't, say no. Adrian, if g5 is played, that loses a pawn. Exactly. But Adrian, you know this stuff. Exactly. Now, so I had played in a tournament in Martinique some long time ago, and I played this woman grandmaster Antoinetta Stefanova. Ah, okay. I do this black too. I played this grandmaster Antoinetta Stefanova, and at that point in time, I did not know that h3 in this position was not good. So one of the things to remember in the Italian is don't play h3 when you're castled. If white castles, don't play h3 if black has not castled as yet. Because if you do, black may not castle, and black may instead play h6, g5, and try to play g4 to attack you. And the reason why black will do that is because that pawn on h3 allows the g5 to g4 moves to work, because the pawn on g4 will be attacking the knight and the pawn, and therefore black will get to open the g file where the rook can get onto the g file. The knight will just, this knight will just move out of the way somewhere, and then the queen will get across and help in the attack somewhere. It could be on f6, it could be on h4. So a game I played h3, and I did not know this. So Stefanova played h6. So then I played knight to h4, because now when she played h6, I started to think to myself, oh, now there might be a problem. Because at the point in time, I didn't really think about it too much. But then I realized she does not intend to castle. She's going to just launch that kingside attack and pop and probably just keep the king in the center. So my best try was to play the knight to h4 and maybe put that knight on f5 and hopefully slow down that pawn storm. But that didn't change anything. Pawn to g5 was played. And you know that what the aim is to play pawn to g4. So when I put the knight on f5, my hope, of course, is that with the knight on f5, when this exchange takes place, at least the bishop is not there to help the move pawn to g4. So after e6 f5, she plays queen to d7. I play queen to f3. And then she simply plays pawn to d5. And what does black do? Black gained control of the center. So black is in control of the center, and soon black will castle. And this rook is going to come across to this line. And then these pawns are going to start moving. And I'm going to be in a lot of trouble. And this is what happened. So after d5, I develop my knight. Then pawn to h5, because the knight on d2 is blocking the bishop's attack on the g pawn. So I gave her time to play pawn to h5. Probably in this position, it might have been better to play knight to e3. So at least I'm still slowing down the pawn storm because the bishop is attacking this pawn. But anyway, knight to d2 was played, h5, then queen to g3, rook g8, then knight f3, attacking the pawn on e5, and the one on g5. And now pawn to h4 is played, and now the queen is forced to go into h2. And now queen takes pawn, and when the queen captures the pawn, the queen, of course, is also defending the pawn on e5 that is under attack. So d5 is played, and I was ignored. Now g4 is played, and now with all those lines open, soon everything just starts crashing through. I play pawn to in this position. But there aren't a lot of choices for white. There are not a lot of choices. But this move is a very good move by black because that pawn blocks the defense of the knight. So now the knight is under attack. So f3 is played, attacking the knight on g4. And that was met by a sacrifice. Knight takes d4, pawn takes d4, bishop takes d4, threatening to play pawn to e2, check, which would win material. And even if the rook moves out of the way first, there is still pawn to e2 check, because when king h1 is played, there's rook h8, defended by the bishop, pinning the queen to the king. And okay, I eventually lost this game. So the main takeaway, of course, this position, going back to this position, is that h3 should not be played if black has not castled. Generally, should not be played if black has not castled. So in this position, it is a lot better to play other moves, mainly knight d2, and wait. And after knight d2 is played, maybe black might play h6 still. I'm not playing h3. There are a number of different moves in this position. Knight c4 is one of them. And if bishop goes to e6, bishop to e3. You are not playing pawn to h6 unless pawn to h3, unless black castles. Even if black plays bishop to g4, you are still not playing pawn to h3. Pawn to h3 should not be played unless black castles on the king side. So, for example, after bishop h3, I can continue with bishop to e3, and the intention of bishop e3 is to play bishop takes bishop, and then put the knight on e3, attacking the bishop on g4. And if that bishop on g4 goes to h5, then knight on e3 will go to f5, which brings me to another important thing about the Italian game. One of the most important squares for white in the Italian game is the f5 square. This is a very important square for white, and it is also a very important square for black, because white always wants to occupy that square, especially with a knight. And that's why when that knight maneuvers his way around to g3, often that knight is going to the f5 square. And many times White plays out, black plays all sorts of different moves just to try to stop white from placing a knight on the f5 square. So let me go to another example. So first, I'm going to start off with what if black tries to play d7 to d5 quickly. So it is quite possible that in the Italian game, after knight f3, knight to c6, bishop to c4, bishop to c5, c3, knight f6, d3, castle. Take note that d5 in this position now, this is a bad move. For example, yeah, from time to time you might hear a dog bark. I do have a dog in my background. Yes, after d5 is played, pawn takes d5, knight takes d5, queen to b3, and black is already in trouble because queen to b3 is an attack on the knight on d5, and if bishop e6 is played to defend the knight, then that loses the pawn on b7 and attacks this knight at the same time. And if knight e5 is played, this does not work because of queen to b5 check, because that loses the bishop on c5. So d5 in this position is not a good idea. So black must castle first, then when white castles. Now it is possible that black can play d5. And this is something that you all must remember if it is you're playing this as black. d5 can be played. But it is not winning, and it is also not losing. After d5, e takes d5, knight takes d5. White should immediately attack that pawn on e5. So rook to e1, the knight and the rook are attacking the pawn. White is threatening to play knight captures e5. Well, at least it appears white is threatening to play knight captures e5. So in this position, I think some people, I don't know if any of you all know this position, but bishop to e6 has been played by some people. And the reason why people play bishop e6 is because after knight captures e5, knight captures e5, and rook captures e5, there is bishop captures f2, because if the king captures, there's queen to f6 check, which gains the rook on e5. So the reason why the bishop went to e6 is because if white blocks the check with the queen, and the queen captures the rook, the knight is defended by 2 pieces. And then black's position would be better. But okay, if the bishop goes back to e6, of course, white will not capture the pawn e5. White should play first knight to d2. And now that sacrifice won't work. For example, if the bishop goes back to the b6, knight takes pawn, knight takes knight, captures, bishop takes f2, king takes f2, queen f6 check. This time, white can block with that same knight on d2, and the knight on d2 defends the rook on e5. So that's a little trick to remember. A trick to remember for black, and also to remember for white, that when you play the knight to d2, that bishop takes f2 trap to get the rook on e5 does not work, because the knight on d2 will go to f3 and protect the rook on e5. But after knight f3 is played, many people play bishop to g4. because when bishop g4 is played, now the knight cannot capture the pawn on e5 because the knight is pinned to the queen. So after bishop g4, now knight to d2 is necessary, protecting the knight so that the queen can get out of the pin. And if the bishop captures the knight, you don't have to capture with the pawn, you can capture with the knight and keep the king side structure intact. Very important that you don't weaken your king side. So when knight to d2 is played, there is no immediate threat by white because white still cannot capture the pawn on e5 because the knight is pinned. So there's no immediate threat. But white does intend to move the queen out of the pin so that there is a threat to capture the pawn on e5. So after knight bd2, knight to b6 can be played. There are actually other moves in position, but after knight to b6, there's h3, attacking the bishop. Bishop goes back to h5. Then bishop to b5 is the main move, but there is another move. There is also pawn to b4, attacking the bishop. The bishop can go back to e7, and after pawn to b5, attacking the knight on c6, knight to a5, and that knight on a5, along with the knight on b6, both attack that bishop on c4, making it difficult for the knight on d2 to move, because then white will lose a pawn. It's not so easy for the knight on d2 to move anymore, because a pawn will be lost on c4. So now, white plays pawn on g4, because white wants to, if white is going to push all these pawns around the board, at least he must get something for it. So white wants to win the pawn on e5. So after pawn to g4, knight takes c4, knight takes c4, knight takes c4, pawn takes c4, queen takes queen, and when the rook recaptures, bishop g6, and then knight takes e5. And okay, white has a slightly weakened pawn structure, but white is up a pawn. But because black has a pair of bishops, and white has this weakened pawn structure, the extra pawn does not give white enough to be able to get an advantage. So this position is basically very close to equal. Maybe slight advantage for white, but very slight. So this is just an idea to remember with d5, that black can play d5, but black does not really get total equality when d5 is played. Another example is when black plays bishop to g4 without playing d5. So e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, c3, knight f6, d3, a6. Of course, d6 is fine as well too. And then there's bishop to g4. The idea of bishop to g4 is very simple. Black wants to limit white and slow down white from being able to play pawn to d4. That's why bishop g4 is played. Of course, in this position, white should not play h3 because black has not castled. Only when black has castled does white play h3. So after bishop g4, white should just continue simply with knight b to d2, protecting the bishop, the knight, sorry, and therefore making it easier to move the queen. But still, that knight wants to go to the g3 square anyway. So for instance, after queen to d7, pawn to b4, and pawn to b4 is played because anytime you're playing as white in the Italian game and black delays castling and plays like bishop to g4 and queen to d7, you must always take into consideration that black might be trying to castle on the queen side. So sometimes it's good to play pawn to b4, attacking that bishop, and basically forcing a position where it's not so easy for black to decide to castle on the queen side because white's pawns might come up the queen side quickly. So usually when b4 is played, black is not castling on the queen side anymore. So when it castles on the king side, now h3 can be played. Now I don't know if any of you all have experienced this position before as white, and people have tried to sacrifice their bishop on h3. This bishop sacrifice in this position does not work. But it is important that one knows how to defend when this sacrifice is played. Have any of you all, well, I mean, I don't know. I know Adrian said he's had these positions before, and Mohan. Have you all ever played this position or something like this where black sacrifices bishop on h3? Maybe as white or maybe as black? Okay. But anyway, let me make sure that you know as white how to defend this attack. So the whole premise of this attack usually is after the pawn captures and queen captures, white wants to play knight to g4, f5, and then rook comes up and across to attack. Now I want to add one thing. If this sacrifice was played with the knight on c6 on a g6 square, then white is in trouble. That would be a difference in the attack. If that knight maneuvers across a g6 and black is able to play this sacrifice with this knight still on the d2 square, or if that knight is on a g3 square, on d2, on g3, then it could be some problems if the knight is on g6. But the knight is not on g6, the knight is on c6. So after queen takes h3, white simply plays knight to f1. Because there is no threat on h2 with knight to g4, because the two knights protect that square. And there is no queen to g3 check using the pawn that is pinned to the king, because the knight on f1 covers that square. So now, after knight to g4, white simply plays bishop to e3, blocking the attack on the pawn. And now, when black plays king to h8, with the intention of playing pawn to f5 to get the rook up and across into the attack, white must not waste any time. White must immediately play knight to h3, where the knight is attacking the knight on g4, and if the knight if he exchanges, knight takes knight, and then plays f5. It's not fast enough because of queen to f3 to try to exchange queens, and the queen can't go very far. The queen can only go to the h4 square to try to avoid the exchange. And now there is bishop takes bishop, and then when we capture, queen to g3, and okay, black might still try to find some way to get an attack going, but for the most part, this is supposed to be easy to defend. In fact, in this position, it's probably better to just capture the pawn, because the bishop can go to e6 and protect that pawn against the rook. And now the rook can't, there's no threat of rook to f6 to g3, because the pawn on f5 is covering that square. And now there's a threat of rook to e4, and even potentially rook to g4, king to g1, rook to g1. And then the person who might be attacking may probably end up being white, who's the one attacking. So usually when h3 is played, the best move would probably be to just put the bishop back on e6. And after bishop e6, there can be an exchange on e6. If f takes e6 is played, white will play knight to c4, and this position is better for white. Although it looks as if black might get some counterplay using the f file, the problem for black is white is threatening to play pawn to a4 and then play pawn to a5 to trap the bishop. So when pawn to a4 is played and black plays pawn to a6, then the knight will capture that bishop on b6, forcing black to capture with the pawn, and you would have weak pawns with double pawns on the b file, and of course he has the weak pawns with the pawns on the e file, and that position is better for white because of black's weak pawn structure. Everybody understand so far? Yes? Jaden, you too? All right. So going back here a bit now. Yeah, so this position, castle d6, knight bd2, bishop e7, bishop b3, bishop g4, the dog is there barking again. There's the ice cream man outside. I'm hearing an ice cream bell. Oh, this dog is gonna be barking until this person with some ice cream thing outside is gone. And you know they're not too fast. You know they're pushing the ice cream. They ring me a bell. Okay, he's nearly gone. I'm still hearing the ice cream bell, so I know he's still outside, but he's further away now. Or is he closer? We don't even have children on this street, so there's nobody's gonna buy any ice cream. Okay, he's gone now. Yes, so bishop to g4. So like I said, bishop to g4 is played with the intention of trying to slow down white's ability to advance this pawn. But the usual response is rook to e1. And after queen to d7, knight to f1. And okay, black can castle on the queen side and castle on the king side. When he castles on the king side, then h3 is played. And of course, like I said, bishop h3 is not working. And usually this bishop does not want to go back to h5. And the reason why is because when knight to g3 is played, it is not favorable for black to allow the knight to capture the bishop. But even so, it is not favorable for black to allow this bishop to exist freely on this diagonal without black challenging that bishop. Because what's going to happen now is that if this bishop goes back to g6, white is not going to capture the bishop. White is not even interested in capturing this bishop. But right now, white wants to occupy the f5 square and then bring the queen to f3 and slowly build. And now white is not even so interested in playing d4 anymore. Now white is interested in attacking on the king side, because there will be threats of playing bishop to g5. And the problem that black has is black can't play pawn to h6, because the bishop on g6 would be captured, because the pawn on f7 cannot recapture, because that pawn is pinned to the king. So for example, let's say black played rook to e8, and then bishop to g5 is played. Now the knight doesn't have any good squares to go to, so the knight will have to be protected. When that knight is protected, then knight to f5 attacking the queen. Then the queen goes back to d8. Then the queen comes up to f3. And now there are other threats. There are threats like knight to h6 check, because if the pawn captures, then the bishop will capture the knight. There are threats of pawn to h4 and then pawn to h5 to try to force the bishop to capture the knight, so that when the other knight captures, then that pawn could go to h6 to weaken this pawn that is defending the knight that is pinned to the queen. Oh, I hope that didn't sound too complicated the way I said it. Did you all understand the problems that black has on the king side when this bishop goes to g6 and allows this bishop to stay on this diagonal? You all understand this? Okay. So it means that in this position, when h3 is played, bishop should just go back to e6. But if black really wants to try to attack white, then black is going to want to castle on the queen side. So let's say black castles on the queen side. When black castles on the queen side, white must be very careful, because you know that black's intention now is to launch those pawns up the king side somehow to attack the king. That's the plan. It's going to take some time, but that is the plan. So after castle, bishop to e3 is an important move. After bishop e3, let's say black plays bishop to e6. And the idea of bishop to e6, actually not bishop e6. Let's say first bishop e3, bishop captures e3 is played. So bishop takes e3, knight takes e3, and then pawn to h5. Black doesn't want to move the bishop. Black wants white to play knight takes bishop, so that when the pawn captures the knight, then the pawn will capture the knight, and then there's an open h file, and then black can try to find some way to use that open h file. We'll probably eventually try to double the rooks on the file and attack. Of course, white is not going to capture the bishop on g4. But now, white can play pawn to h3. And the reason why white can play pawn to h3 is because, remember, the attack with playing g4 and g5 can only work if g5 can be played. But there is no pawn on h6 to support g5. So playing g5 for black is going to take some time. It's not so easy to play g5 as yet, g5 quickly, because there's no pawn on h6 to support playing g5. So that's why white can play h3. After h3 is played, if the bishop captures on f3 and the queen captures, now, again, it's still not easy to play any pawns down the g file, because the f5 square is weak. So a knight might eventually jump into this square. And then soon, simple moves, rook to d1 and then pawn to d4 will be played, and white's position will be better. There will be no real way for black to successfully play g5 to g4 because of the weaknesses on the file. Pawn on f7, the knight is protected by the pawn, and the weak f5 square. Those are the things that's going to make it difficult for black to play pawn to g5. Even if the rook was to get behind the pawn, it's still too difficult to play. So it means that more likely the bishop will go to e6. When the bishop goes to e6, black's intention is to play rook to g8, and then g5, then g4 to attack. That is black's intention, nothing complicated. So white must not be too slow. White must act quick enough. Bishop takes bishop, and when the queen captures, pawn to b4. Don't waste time. After pawn to b4, pawn to d5, knight to g5 attacking the queen. And when that queen moves, pawn to a4. Don't waste any time. Now, white's attack is coming fast. Black still can't play g5 and g4. If white wants to kill the attack, he can play pawn takes pawn. And after pawn captures, exchange queens. But then this position is better for white. White has an attack on this pawn right now. This knight can come into the square and put pressure on the g pawn. So this position is slightly better for white because white has better activity in the position. Otherwise here, after h3, this sacrifice here also does not work. After pawn captures bishop, queen recaptures on h3. Simply knight to g5, attacking the queen. And when the queen attacks the knight, knight takes pawn. Because the knight on f7 is defending the square. Oops. Is defending the square on h6, so the rook cannot successfully get up and across. And after knight to g5, simply queen f3. Queen on f3 is protecting the f2 pawn, so this is just a check. King moves, and the king might even decide to just go across on the other side of the board and maintain an advantage from across there. So again here, it's very important to understand how to meet these positions when bishop to g4 is played. Bishop to g4 is not winning. Well, of course it's not winning, but bishop g4 is not winning black any advantage. In fact, players who play the Italian often think that when black plays bishop to g4, it's good for white. And the reason why they often think it is good for white is because when knight to g3 is, when that knight gets to g3, and h3 is eventually played if black castles, the only real good move for that bishop is usually to put the bishop on e6. So it sometimes appears that when black plays bishop to g4, it might be a waste of a move. Well, some people still play it, but it might be a waste of a move because that bishop is probably going to want to go back to e6 anyway. Because white does not want to rush to play d4. So when the bishop goes to g4 to slow down white from playing d4 too quickly, the mere fact is white should not play d4 too quickly anyway. So, and in some cases, some players don't even play d4, don't hardly play d4 at all. I mean, for instance, in my games, when I play the Italian game, d4 is not played much. I mean, it's played, but many of my games, I don't play d4 at all. or if I play d4, it's way down in the game. Sometimes even like in the end game, or close to the end game, d4 is played. Because when my opponent's castle on the king side, I am trying to launch a slow king side attack. Another thing to note about this position is that when black castles, so when white plays, we have this position, bishop to b3 is played, and black castles. Quickly, bishop to g5 is an interesting option as well. Bishop to g5, if it is not met correctly, could almost be considered as winning. So for example, if black just plays bishop to b7 and just tries to play this position as normal, then knight to d2, and then bishop to e6. The problem that black is always going to have now is that the queen on d8 can't go to d7 because the bishop takes knight on f6, opening up the king side. So for example, after bishop to after bishop to c2, if h6 is played, the bishop goes back to g5. It's still not so easy to get out of that pin. This pin is a problem. And there's a simple intention of playing rook to e1, knight to f1, to g3, to h5, making use of that pin. G5 has been played sometimes, and it's very dangerous to play g5. So now there's the attack on this knight. But of course, there is some strange defense with rook to h6 and rook to h8 and rook to h6, where basically black will give away the rook for the bishop. It's not too clear if it's good. Another defense also is sometimes to play knight to b8 and then put that knight on d7. That is also another defense that can be played. But in this position, I think that when the bishop goes to e6, with bishop g5, bishop e6, white should not play bishop to c2. White should start off with rook to e1 first, or pawn to h3, or even knight to c4. This move could also be played. Knight to c4 with the intention of playing to e3 and then going to f5. Now this is the part where it starts to get a little bit complicated. This is the part where it starts to get complicated. So I don't want to make it too complicated. So do any of you all have any questions you want to ask on the Italian? I try to make it as simple as possible. Any questions? No questions? Okay. I'm going to show you all quickly a game that I played in the Italian, and then that would be the end of the session. Let me go to that game. This was a game I played at a tournament in Suriname, where I'm playing white. E4, E4, E5, E3, C6, bishop C4, knight F6, D3, bishop E7. So in this game, also Italian game, this time the bishop, black did not develop the bishop to C5, but put it on E7. So after bishop e7, castle, castle, bishop to b3, d6, c3, knight a5. So of course the bishop is going back to c2, and then he plays c5. So this is a setup that black sometimes plays, which also is aimed at the d4 square. So if white tries to play pawn to d4, there'll be a bunch of exchanges on d4, and then at least white does not have 2 pawns in the center. So after c5, knight bd2 was played, and h6, rook to e1. Normal plan, rook to e1 with the intention of knight to f1 to g3. So black plays rook to e8, knight f1, bishop f8, h3. h3, always important to play h3, because if white wants to play pawn to d4, you should not allow the bishop to go to g4. No, this is a different, this position is a little bit different. So this time, if white wants to play d4, he has to play h3, so that the bishop does not go to g4, because the bishop won't go to g4 for itself. Only if white plays d4, then the bishop goes to g4. So that's why h3 is played, so that white can play d4. So after h3, knight c6, and now d4 is played, trying to take control of the center. So d4, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, and then black plays d5. D5 is quite an interesting move, trying to eliminate all the center pawns. So after d5, knight takes knight, and pawn recaptures, pawn takes pawn, exchange of rooks, and then pawn takes pawn. So now what we have here, we have an isolated pawn on d5. And white also has these open lines towards the king, right? So the bishop on d4, the bishop on c2, pointing there towards the king side, where white can try to continue putting some pressure along those diagonals against black. So after bishop to d4, black plays rook to c8, rook to c1, and the bishop, chase away the rook from the attack on d4. Then this was repeated. So the bishop on d4 is a very important thing. Bishop on d4 blockades the pawn on d5 so it can't move. And what white is going to do now is white is going to try to reorganize pieces to put more pressure in the center against that isolated pawn on d5, while trying to use the diagonals as well, while also trying to use these bishops on these diagonals as well to white's advantage. So after g6 is played, now bishop to d3, which really is just an exchange of rooks. But now, after queen to e3, there is now a threat of queen to e5, with, of course, with threats of checkmate and using that diagonal. And that's the thing about these positions. Many times g6 is played to try to limit the mobility of this bishop, or sometimes to defend the f5 square. But then that might open up the other bishop diagonal, the diagonal of the bishop on d4. So after queen to e3 is played, bishop to g7 was played, neutralizing the bishop on the diagonal. And after the exchange, queen to e5 check. And now knight to g3. And this idea is seen a lot. When this diagonal gets opened, that diagonal a1, b1 to h7, many times in Italian game, even although so many pieces have been exchanged, this idea of playing h4 to h5 with the knight on g3 is a very popular idea in the Italian game. The knight is on g3, and then white plays h4, and then white plays h5, attacking the g pawn that was put there to defend the f5 square. So knight to g3. And when black plays queen to h4, the knight goes to h5 because the knight is defended by the queen. So the queen cannot capture the knight because the queen takes queen, as the pawn on g6 is pinned to the king. And now there's a threat of knight to f6 check with a bunch of checks that have some mating threats. So knight h5, so black plays knight to e8, protecting the g7 square because there was also a threat of checkmate on g7, and protecting against knight f6 check. So now knight to f4, another threat. The threat is to capture the pawn on g6, and after the pawn recaptures, then capture the bishop on e6. That will win a pawn. So the queen goes back to e7 to defend the bishop on e6. But although it defends the bishop on e6, the bishop on e6 is under attack by two pieces. And okay, there was a bunch of errors, probably to some extent, played in this position, and it eventually ended like this because after king h7, knight f6 is checkmate. But for the most part, going back, notation. But for the most part, going back, it is important to know why h3 was played. White wants to play d4. So when white plays d4, the bishop will go to g4. So let's imagine here, white plays d4 immediately. Not d4, sorry. Let's imagine here white plays knight to g. Then knight to c6, and then he plays d4. After pawn takes pawn and pawn takes pawn, now there is bishop to g4. And the threat is to capture the pawn on d4. Now if pawn takes pawn is played, the knight can capture the pawn. And now white cannot stop knight takes knight, and then the pawn must recapture, damaging the kingside defense. So you see, if white wants to play d4, white needs to play h3. And in this position, d4 is an important move. But white must play h3 first if he wants to play the pawn to d4. So right here, that was my game, a game that I played in a tournament in Suriname. I hope everybody understood the session on the Italian game. I would also suggest that if you intend to play the Italian, you should get a book called Winning, this book here, Winning with the Slow but Venomous Italian. It's a very good book on the Italian game. It will teach you a lot of stuff. It's a bit advanced, but it's a good book for learning the Italian game. And of course, there are many videos all around YouTube where one can find more information on playing the Italian. Other than that, if any of you are interested in any coaching of the sort from me, I'm just giving you my email address, tapachess@gmail.com. That's my email address. And I usually do most of my sessions over chess. So I hope everyone enjoyed the session, and I hope you'll have learned a lot, maybe enough to make you decide to play the Italian game, maybe enough to pick up to fill a few gaps here and there of things that you may not have known. Now you know them. And I hope other than that, you'll enjoy the rest of your day. And keep playing chess. All right, so that's it for today, y'all. If you have any questions, you can put them now. Otherwise, we are finished. Any questions? Okay. All right, y'all. Thanks for joining. That's the end there. Goodbye.